Well, in a saga of many twists and turns, a dispute between the TTC and its largest transit union appears to have been resolved.
After the TTC filed an application with Ontario's Labour Board claiming the workers' union had encouraged members to not reveal their vaccine status to employers, the union walked back on their decision a day later. The standoff, however, raising questions about whether an employer has the right to know their workers' vaccination status.
All right, joining us with more on this complex issue is employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Lior, always great to see you. Let's start with the obvious question. Does the TTC, or frankly any company, have the right to know their employees' vaccination status, unionized or non-unionized?
Well, Anthony, the answer is that arguably no, they don't. Other than the obvious privacy issues with disclosing that type of medical information, in Ontario, we have a statute called the Occupational Health and Safety Act that specifically says that an employer cannot demand personal private medical information and can't penalize employees for refusing to produce it. And that really applies here. Now, the exception, of course, would be situations where there's a government mandate in place that requires the employer to have all its employees vaccinated. Obviously, the only way to meet that mandate is if you know the vaccine status. But that does not apply to the TTC, and it's because of that that I was very surprised, shocked actually, that the TTC would give up on that issue so quickly when I think the law is on its side.
So if the law is on its side and you expand it to other workplaces as well, what do employees do if their employer is asking them to disclose their vaccination status?
Well, I think the first thing an employee has to ask him or herself is, do they actually care about disclosing the vaccine status? Law aside, if you're comfortable with it, if you don't have no issue with it, you may want to disclose just to avoid any potential conflict. But for those individuals that do not feel comfortable disclosing, it's okay to say no. It's okay to point out to the employer that there are laws preventing and protecting your rights to privacy and to protect your medical information. Keeping in mind, of course, that some employers have drawn that line in the sand. So despite you being in the right, so to speak, your employer may choose to take measures against you, legal or not. So that balancing has to be done by an employee as to whether they care or not.
Now, I mentioned it's complex and it's also very divisive, whether you're pro or anti-vaccine. There's something, as you mentioned, called the law, and it kind of leads into the bigger question. I mean, disclosure is one thing, but what about punishment? Can somebody be fired from the job if they don't want to reveal their vaccination status?
And I think the way to look at it is, can someone be fired legally from their job? Because I will tell you that employees have been and will continue to be fired if they don't disclose, if they don't get vaccinated, regardless of the legality of it. Employers are feeling strongly about that. But the reality is that in many of those situations, if you are let go because of your vaccine status, unless there's a government mandate, that decision by your employer may be illegal. Not only would you be entitled to severance, again, up to 24 months pay right there, there could be human rights damages as well. So employees have to keep that in mind, and employers have to keep that in mind, because the liability could be significant.
But let's talk more about what happened at the TTC. You mentioned that you were surprised that the union backed down on its decision. As we know, that is what happened not long after hearing about what the TTC was planning to do. But what does this mean now? Because what if they did not back down, the union that is, and what kind of implications could this potentially have on other workplaces?
Well, certainly TTC is a large union, a lot of employees. I think a lot of other union and employees were looking at that situation to see how it develops. And I think it potentially may be demoralizing for some of its employees. The other concern that I have is it sets a dangerous precedent potentially. Today, the union has agreed to vaccination status. What happens if tomorrow or next year the TTC wants to have x-rays and blood work copies of what their employees had? That is a potential significant problem. And the real issue to me is going to be if the TTC union, who has said in the past that they're going to challenge their employers' vaccine mandates, now that they gave up on the issue of vaccination status, are they also going to concede on that point, or are they going to try to protect its employees with respect to vaccination and whether or not they're vaccinated? That's going to be very interesting to see.
Interesting questions, and it clears up a lot of it, but it is ironic in a way because the union, by nature, is there to defend employees' rights. It's one thing in a non-unionized workplace, but in this case, it's interesting as well. Lior, we appreciate this. That is employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.